Good evening, everybody. A very warm welcome to all of you. So we are here now gathered to have the fourth lecture in the MS Swaminathan Centenary Lecture Series. The first three lectures looked at agriculture from a more crop perspective. So in the fourth lecture in the series, we move slightly away. We have with us Professor V K Ramachandran. He is the Vice Chairperson of the Kerala State Planning Board. He is also the Managing Trustee of the Foundation for Agrarian Studies and Editor for the Review of Agrarian Studies. He is also the Founder Trustee for MSSRF. His interests in work include agrarian relations and rural development. Today he will be talking about peasants and rural wage workers in contemporary India. Welcome, sir. We look forward to your lecture now. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and good evening to my many friends who I see online. Thank you very much. I'm honored to speak in this series to pay tribute to MS Swaminathan. In his time, India's most distinguished agricultural scientist and one of the world's great policy experts, policy makers, and institution builders in the spheres of food, agriculture, and agriculture-related activities. As Gayatri mentioned, I edit a journal called the Review of Agrarian Studies, and last year, after his death, we published a tribute to Dr. Swaminathan. Scientists, many of them his colleagues, wrote on different aspects of his contributions to science and policy. Each one wrote about his contributions to science and policy, but each one of them also referred to the magic of his personality, his wisdom, his kindness and humanity, and his utter dedication to the tasks that he set himself. I am also, as Gayatri mentioned, the last one alive of the three who signed the original trust deed for the MSSRF. Watching him apply a lifetime's experience to the establishment of the foundation was an experience in itself. It was an experience that was of great value to me when we established the Foundation for Agrarian Studies and the journal, and later in the job that now occupies me in Kerala. Let me digress a bit on this. When we were setting up the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, he advised us on what should be he suggested that we keep in mind three principles of organization when we established an institution. One was, is there a felt need for this institution? Is there a demand for what you want to study? Does the world need this institution? The second was, is there anyone doing the same thing? If there is, and who are doing it reasonably well, consider strengthening that organization rather than setting up a new institution of your own. And the third was that when you as an organization are going to be donor supported, you can be nothing other than donor supported, but never let your research be donor driven. And these were enormously important recommendations for us, and we tried to follow them. And as I said, working in policy in Kerala now, dealing with institutions, this is really it was a very important lesson for me. And so to my present topic. MS Swaminathan devoted his life to the improvement of the lives of farmers, to farming, and to put an end to the misery of poverty and hunger and malnutrition. This then is a lecture on classes in India's countryside and on the two major components of India's rural working class, the peasantry and wage workers. The a very before I really go into this into the meat of this, I'd like to point out some of the really important features of the rural workforce in India. Its enormous and expanding size. The official statistics on labor, I mean, our official statistics are incomplete. We criticize our official statistics, and rightly so. But although incomplete, they give us an approximate figure on the size of the rural workforce. The striking and somewhat unexpected finding that emerged in our work from the National Sample Survey, that is from the Employment and Unemployment Surveys, and from the Provisional Labour Force Survey, is that the absolute numbers of rural workers in India, especially women workers, has risen over the last decade, and more visibly in the last 5 years. The number of women workers rose from 101 million to in 2011-12 to 153 million in 2023-24. And the number of male workers over the same period rose from 233 to 258 million. In total, there were, by this count, there were 411 million rural workers in India last year. This is a, sorry, I have to keep wiping my eyes. I have a problem with eye watering. These are I just received these data yesterday. We worked on this yesterday, but these are figures to conjure with. What is the population of Europe, the entire population of Europe, compared to the rural, just the force of rural workers in India, and so on. But so we asked the question: who are they? Who are they? This great mass of rural workers in South Asia, and particularly India, and what are their socio-economic characteristics? To answer these, I should refer to various classical writings. I come from a Marxist tradition. I shall also refer to the literature, and I shall refer to a series of surveys that have been undertaken from the early part of the century by the Foundation for Agrarian Studies in its program of rural surveys. I shall particularly refer to 6 villages which we have resurveyed since 2018. 2 of them are in Uttar Pradesh, one in Bijnor district in western UP. It is a rice-wheat rotation with sugarcane village, which has participated in the sugarcane boom of the last decade. The second village is in eastern UP. It is a Dalit-dominated village with rather less successful agriculture, less irrigation. 2 villages, one in West Champaran in Bihar, one in Samastipur in Bihar, and 2 villages in the Lower Kaveri Delta, very different, Palakurchi and Venmani. I shall refer to them from time to time, but let us first turn now to the first category that I mentioned, peasants. The peasantry as a social group is a social group that is enormously historically resilient. That is enormously historically resilient from right from the time that agricultural surpluses began. That it is not really associated with any. It is a category which has existed and spanned over many different kinds of social formations, under slavery, under feudalism, and under capitalism, indeed under capitalism. So as the social formation changed, so did the character of the peasantry. Let us take, and it has undergone many many qualitative changes. Let us take Marx's definition, the famous definition in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, where Marx, the famous quotation, of course, which many non-people who have not read the rest, much of Marx may have seen, is where he referred to the French peasantry as the mass of the French peasantry as a sack of potatoes. But the more serious, what I think that came from a more deep analysis of the peasantry, where Marx says that when he talks about the small holding peasant, he says that their field of production, the small holding, permits no division of labor in its cultivation, no application of science, and therefore no multifariousness of development, no diversity of talent, and no wealth of social relationships. Each individual peasant family is almost self-sufficient, directly produces most of its consumer needs, and thus acquires its means of life more through an exchange with nature than in intercourse with society. Clearly that the phase of that kind of peasantry is over. That is, it is not true of the modern peasantry. In fact, it was not true of, it began to be less true of many sections of the peasantry, even in India and even in the late 19th century. It is clear that such a definition is not true of the modern peasantry, both with regard to the productive forces and, of course, the whole discussion of the application of science and technology, as well as to the relations of production, in particular to the subjugation. Today, the basic relationship of a peasant is not with nature, but with the market itself, with the market under capitalism. So let us take the many other classical definitions of the peasantry. One which refers to the peasantry as petty producers who cultivate entirely with their own means of production, including labor. That too has changed. In fact, but what does all of these had changed by independence, and certainly when I was doing my PhD, when we were working in the 70s, when later, even in the first round of surveys conducted by the foundation in the early 70s, in the early 2000s, in the early 21st century, in the first decade of the 21st century, the peasantry was a group where the household, whatever else had changed, the main income and most of the time of the members of the household was spent on agriculture. That is crop production and related production. How true is that today? Are these households that we identify as petty producers in the countryside, how true is even that most of their income and most of their comes from and most of their time is spent on crop production? Even that is disappearing. Even that is reducing. When we, in our recent surveys in Uttar Pradesh, in Bihar and Tamil Nadu, it's really shrinking. When we looked at net incomes, it was even in the place where agriculture was sort of was growing in the UP sugarcane villages, it was less than 40%. 40% was being produced. 40% of the income of a peasant family, of this petty producer family, came from agriculture. In the Tamil Nadu villages, it was even less. In certain cases, it was 6%, 10%, 20% of net income was coming from agriculture, and there was a decline in the number of members of the household who were actually participating in the major manual operations on the land. In fact, the whole concept of manual operations on the land has changed. But so this was so what's happened to the peasantry? Can you call it a peasantry anymore? We then looked, my colleague, some of my colleagues and I looked at this, and then we looked at the gross value of output in the villages, looking at the total gross value of agricultural output, including animal husbandry output. This changed the picture completely. 60%, 50%. It suddenly rose. Tamil Nadu, it was still very low, but it would vary across different villages and different types of agriculture in India. But the share in gross value of output of this section of the population was still very high. So the contribution of petty production to production as a whole was still very high. And it would vary, of course, across different socioeconomic. scenarios, it was very high in the Uttar Pradesh villages. It was relatively low in the lower Kaveri Delta villages. I think that I would like to see, but I predict somewhat low these things in the proportions also in the canal irrigated areas, say, of Rajasthan, of Doaba villages in the Punjab, and in West Bengal, by contrast, I predict that the share of the petty production in the total value of output is still going to be very high. So by this important indicator, I think this has emerged as a very important indicator of peasant participation in crop production, this share of the GVO, of the gross value output that they produce. So after much searching through the data, we actually did come to the conclusion that the rumors of the death of the peasantry have been much exaggerated. So as a social group, it still exists and it plays a very important role in production as a whole. So what I've been dealing with so far is actually what the peasantry is not. The other thing that the peasantry is not is a homogeneous mass. They are not because they are different. They are differentiated. The differentiation into different classes is the hallmark of a peasantry, particularly in India. But what is very clear is that this is extremely petty production in almost every part of India. In almost every part of India, the peasantry is crowded into, if you classify the villages by the size classes of holdings, into 0.25 to 2 hectares. So this has important consequences for incomes. It has important consequences for a highly differentiated peasantry, has very differentiated access to technology, to markets, to credit, to the very differentiated lengths of recovery time from extreme climate events, and so on. We have, this is a point that we must, this differentiation, this discrimination in the market against the rural poor, the depression of incomes because of this is something, of course, which is a fact that has brought lakhs of peasants into the struggles that are now being conducted in different parts of India, and especially around the hugely militant struggles around the three agricultural laws which had to be withdrawn. In terms of incomes, one thing that we found in the first round of our surveys was the new prevalence among the poor of a substantial number, sometimes up to 20% of small producers earning negative incomes from, the word is not earning, discerning, de-earning negative incomes from agriculture, and particularly from crop production. This, I'm not saying it's something uniform across the last few decades. In fact, in Uttar Pradesh, we've seen even among the smaller sections, sections of the poorer sections of the peasantry, we have seen income improvements over the 20-teens in sugarcane. What I'd like to stress here is that incomes have been low, and incomes are the peasantry is highly vulnerable to both income or to different kinds of shocks, extreme weather events, and to other shocks in the market. Let me go on to the differentiation of peasants with respect to labor. This is something which is, I think, an extremely important component in the socioeconomic characteristics of the peasantry. One is that the most important factor here is the decline in labor absorption on different plots of land, on individual plots of land, in agriculture as a whole, particularly in cereal production since over the last 2 decades. This has led to, this is because of many things. It's because of mechanization, it's because of farming practices, because of new technologies. But the thing is that it has been followed by a decline in family labor and a decline in the number of people in individual families who actually work on the land. So that kind of centrality that that peasant labor had in the lives of the family is changing with more and more members of those families going to other occupations and to other. This, we have, as a result, there's a very important consequence here, is the different forms that proletarianization, the formation of an agricultural proletariat from the peasantry takes. There are two main tendencies here. One is that, no, let me just step back. See, earlier, the classical writing, Sundaraya, others, differentiated the peasantry on this basis that the poor peasants would never hire in workers, but they would work out for wages. A middle peasant would neither hire in labor or work for wages on somebody else's land. A rich peasant would hardly work on his own land, on her own land, their own land, and would get most of their work done by others. Now these barriers are broken. Poor sections of the peasantry, the market for hired labor has increased its coverage across the peasantry. That's the important point here. Poor peasants join the large mass of wage workers. Middle peasants join the large mass of wage workers. Sometimes even people from the upper sections of peasantry join the mass of wage workers. And hired workers are used by all sections of the peasantry. So this extension of the market for wage labor characterizes the new situation. In this, and now I come to the question of proletarianization, there are two features of proletarianization. One is just the loss of land. Many people, they get negative incomes, they're poor, they can no longer work on the land. There's nobody in the household to continue with peasant cultivation. So they lose the land and landlessness increases. Landless wage workers proliferate. That is one way, the losing land. The other aspect of proletarianization is a very important one in India now. That is that more and more people from every class, what I just mentioned, from every class of the peasantry is now working out. They work as agricultural workers, but they also work at non-agricultural tasks in the village and outside. We did some exercises, and earlier, this was many years ago, if you took, for a village which you survey, if you take the number of days of wage labor worked by everyone in the village, get a total. Only about 50% of that total number of days was wage labor performed by people who were mainly wage workers. The other 50% was by people who were working who were members of the peasantry, who had other occupations in the village. So this indicates a very large spread of the market for labor power in the village, increasing its coverage. This tendency In fact, it was noted in the early 20th century in Europe, in Russia, in other parts, where the bulk of the farmers owning such insignificant plots of land that it is impossible to make a living from them, and which represent merely an auxiliary occupation, form part of the reserve army of unemployed in the capitalist system as a whole. This is Lenin on Europe and Russia, actually. It would be wrong to imagine that this reserve army of unemployed consists only of workers who are out of work. It also includes peasants or petty farmers who are unable to exist on what they get from their minute farms, who have to try to obtain their means of subsistence mainly by hiring out their labor. I mean, it's a question of an old process repeating itself in a modern context in a different form. Now let us turn now to wage workers, hired wage workers in the countryside. The first thing to note is that the number and share of manual workers and skilled, unskilled wage workers is increasing in the countryside. In other words, there is increasing proletarianization. This is the data that I cited in the beginning. We have, it's 411 million workers and growing. This is manual workers is very much a part of this, tendency. And yet there is, while we say this, there's, and yet on the other hand, manual workers and poor and middle peasants in different villages have acquired small operational holdings in different ways, tiny operational holdings in different ways. So while the overall trend is towards the expansion of the class of manual workers and the widening of the base of manual workers, particularly workers who migrate to other parts of India, continue to maintain organic links with their home villages and to acquire small operational holdings in different ways. In the Western UP village, it was as tenants of sugarcane farmers. In the Eastern UP village, the Dalit households leased in small-scale cultivation for consumption, for subsistence, for food grain, and not really for sales, but with very limited marketed surplus. In the Western Bihar village, which I mentioned, in West Champaran district, a very interesting phenomenon of generations of migrant workers had, with their savings, were actually mortgaging in land, small plots of land in their native village. In yet another, and there's also reverse tendency where landlords were leasing in land. In the Samastipur village, traditional leases continued of the old style, giving out land to control labor, but also there had been, because of this, it's a combination in Samastipur of very high technological, very high mechanization and technological transformation with very backward social relations. So the places where the machines would not go were then being leased out. So what we're talking about in general is that while the impetus for leasing in among the semi-proletariat can historically be found in many sources, the leasing for basic subsistence, less for cash and more for subsistence, is a counter tendency to this pure sort of people losing their land. It's a very important counter tendency. Let me say a few more things about the characteristics of agricultural workers. One is that the class of wage workers now in rural India is not restricted to agriculture. When I was a student, I could distinguish a class of agricultural workers, and non-agricultural were different. Today, the class of manual labor workers and wage workers is, well, they come together. they work at agricultural. I must, in order to avoid confusion, 90% of them work in agriculture in some way. About 80% would work in some way in agriculture and spend some of their time in agriculture. But they also work in non-agriculture. They work not only in the village, but outside the village labor market. And indeed, they work, we have tracked from the West Bengal villages workers who come close to where I work in Kerala. They have an all-India footprint, almost literally, today, the workforce. As I said, of the total number of days of wage labor, a significant share is by members of households that are not necessarily mainly household workers. I'd also like to say that the agricultural labor being the class of wage workers are the most heterogeneous of caste heterogeneous of the different classes in the countryside. To a certain extent now, the poor peasantry, as leasing increases by Dalits and other families, that is also emerging as a caste heterogeneous class. It's also, of course, the reality of our countryside that manual labor is a major occupation of Dalit and scheduled tribe households. So poor peasants and wage workers, they kind of move back and forth between their class positions. I'd like to just make a few points also on women workers. Women in this, again, this is new data from the unemployment and employment surveys and from the labor force surveys. There are two very important points. First, the proportion of rural workers engaged in agricultural activities fell among men from 59 to 50% over the decade. At the same time, the share of women workers engaged in agriculture rose from 74 to 77%. These women, that women are now the major constituent of the agricultural workforce, according to the secondary sources of data, is now must be integrated into our analysis and our understanding. It must, because if there's going to be a force for social change, if the people of rural areas are going to mobilize themselves and they're going to be mobilized for progressive social change, women must be central to that struggle. The second and related feature to emerge from official labor statistics is that women exceed men in the casual labor force. 21 million women now to 19 million men. In the category of self-employed in agriculture, the number of women has risen to 95 million, while the number of men is still higher, of course, 106 million. In short, among the self-employed, the number of women is rising sharply, although still lower than the number of men. But in the agricultural female wage labor force, there are more women workers than men. So every time you consider an agrarian movement or struggle, we must look at to what extent are women being leading that struggle and involved in that struggle. Last comment on the wage workers. When we first started in the early, in the first wave of our studies, one thing that we found was a decline, as I mentioned, in the number of days of work that were available. But wage rates in most of India, Kerala is an exception, were so low that if in a family of five, say, if every member of the family was to attain poverty line incomes, then two members of that household had to work for a minimum of 300 to 320 days a year. Now those were impossible numbers. These were because the number of days of employment was about, in agriculture in those days, was about 100, 120, sometimes less, sometimes more. So, to achieve only India's wretched poverty line of you had to work about 600 days, two people would have to work 600 days in a household of 5. That situation, now what has happened since then? Consider, the number of days of work in agriculture have gone down, labor absorption in agriculture has gone down, and at the same time, as my colleagues have shown in Arindam Das, Professor Usami and others, rural wages, agricultural wages, are more or less stagnant over the last decade. So that question of extreme poverty, that is a matter of great concern, and I should now start. How much time do I have? Huh? Okay. Gayatri gives me another 5 minutes. So, but I would like, I would like to make one point on this matter, is that when we are studying these issues, we must take into account the enormous diversity of the unevenness of development of capitalism in India, the different aspects of the social formation. There are an infinite number of combinations that are possible. You could have very high technology, very backward social relations, witness Bihar. You could have, in some places, Samastipur is what I have in mind, you could have relatively advanced infrastructure and education with a sharp decline in agrarian surpluses and incomes, particularly of the poor, witness the Lower Kaveri Delta. You could, so the enormous variation now makes for great complexity, and great complexity in policy and organization for those who are involved in the political organization of the rural people, the rural masses for social change. Excuse me a second. I would like to refer, before I end, to when I was doing my PhD this month. I once approached P. Sundaraya, whose close knowledge of rural India was unparalleled, and asked him about the whole issue of differentiation. That if you're going to have differentiation, what is the future prospect of differentiation? Is it, well, to cut a long story short, he understood what I was trying to say, and he said that in a state where you do not have land reform, in a state where the worst forms of oppression have not been decisively swept away, in a state where the all kinds of pre-capitalist forms still exist. Don't think that just by the efflux of time, you'll come to a situation where you have only landlords on the one side and only workers on the other, and you can organize them like you organize a trade union. Life itself is much more complex. What you will have in a state where the failure of the ruling class is to implement land reform, in such a state, what you're going to have is great complexity. You're going to pay the price for not having land reform in infinitely more difficult and complex forms of social relations you're going to have to deal with. Please keep that in mind. I must say that before I end, I should also say that there's a whole lot of issues here that I'm not dealing with. That is the conditions under which labor power is reproduced. I'm not talking about poverty and food consumption today, or about access to education, health and housing, or access to the means of scientific and rational culture of science, etc. I'm not really going to talk about that. Let me return to what I said about Sundaraya. So in this kind of society where there are very few pockets of our society which have had a land reform, and therefore a basis on which you can build something new, what's going to happen is not a kind of automatic polarization, but greater complexity. So let me now draw to a close. Just as MSS did more than any other individual of his time to bring to India an agricultural revolution, it will be the great task of the next generation to ensure a new social order through agrarian revolution. And I see I looked a little while ago at my many young colleagues who are on both online and many who are here. What can I do except to enjoin you to work hard to understand the complexities of which P. Sundaraya spoke, and to make the agrarian revolution. Thank you. I have one last before I go. Of course, I'm always indebted to my younger colleagues, but for this particular lecture, for for working on the data and for much discussion, they're all here either one way or the other, online or not. Niladri Shekhar Dar, Mrityunjay Pandey, C.A. Ritu, Dona Safui, C.A. Setu, and Madhura Swaminathan. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for sharing your perspective with us, Professor Ramachandran. If there are any questions from the audience here, first at MSSRF, we'll take them.
MN-IREGA Act and its implementation, however, whatever its weaknesses, that must have contributed to this increase in the labor force. That's one possibility. And the other question is unrelated. You saw the Punjab farmers' protest, as it was called, and they succeeded in having the 3 farm laws repealed. In light of your analysis, what would you say about the composition of those who were in the forefront of that agitation, successful agitation? Maybe, I know you haven't studied that, but any insights?
I'm happy to. Jairam, you want to add to that? Since you said you were going to ask me about Jairam generally had a question on the politics of the political implications. Okay. On MNREGA, let me say that MNREGA is the occupation of a very important source of income in India's villages. It's a last, for many people, it's a last resort. It's not a last resort. It saves them. Without MNREGA, you'll fall into complete destitution. So it's played an enormous role in that sense, and particularly in the immediate aftermath of its introduction. As we know now, the wages are very low. Of course, different states have different wages. Kerala is the highest, but the government of India has not been releasing the money that has been budgeted under MNREGA. There's a decline in its implementation. Whether it is it's an extremely important as a guarantee. It's an extremely important source of subsistence. However, and I think to add to your question, it is also a factor in increasing the non-agricultural component of the deployment of labor in a year. No question of that. Whether it is independently pushing people off the land, I don't think so. And also there's this whole, there's of course the rural rich often say that these MNREGA has pushed up wages, pushed up agricultural wages, and for that reason we are losing on agriculture. I don't accept that argument either. But as a great source of as an important source of subsistence, as a potential source of infrastructure, and as a factor in increasing the non-agricultural component of people's wages. It's played a very important role. It's also, it's somewhat free. It's somewhat free. Yeah, it's somewhat. I have not dealt with the whole question of free and unfree labor today, but it is. It varies whether you're in Madhya Pradesh or in Tamil Nadu, but it is somewhat free of extra economic coercion by the rural rich. On your second question is much more difficult. I think that. Yeah, we have to look at this very carefully. We have to. It has to be given the fact that there's been this huge increase in the labor force, and given the fact that now the manual worker force covers large sections of the peasantry, how is it that that is not the movement that is really taking off? No? How is it that combined movement of peasants and workers is not really the movement that is dominating our countryside? The one thing is that in the countryside today, I think from time to time, the differences arise from the point of view of state power. Differences arise even within there's a process of push and pull, even within the ruling sections of our society. And this certainly represented the attempt to impose the 3 farm laws certainly represented one such episode between the landlords and big capitalist farmers on the one hand, within the ruling structure. This, and as I said, on the one hand you have proletarianization, but you also have a very large section who are self-employed as farmers and peasants in the countryside, people who are discriminated against in their access to agricultural technologies, who join this struggle in huge numbers. So although this also served the interests of the rural rich, the personnel of the movement were actually large sections of the peasantry. Of course, that's how it developed, in my view. I look forward to the day when where those who actually work on the land are able to, form an independent force in the countryside, along with rural workers, rather than this alliance. But this alliance did, I think, it had an objective basis in the huge numbers of people who are actually involved in agriculture. And as I said, the gross value of output now still comes from the poorer sections of farmers. So that was a binding factor in this. In fact, it's only in the last 2 or 3 days where I've seen the extent to which the peasantry actually has a stake in production is something which is coming out to me. Yeah.
I might only strengthen your question. Given the very small proportion of the per capita GDP of the farming sector, and express aspiration to become a developed nation by economy and so on, do you foresee any need to change, redefine the participation of the farming system to be able to reach this number in some form? Because you can't grow from 500 US dollar to $12,000 US in finite period of time, because that's the kind of per capita GDP today in agriculture. Are we looking at gross GDP with a kind of segregation that should not happen in a country of this kind? Because today the ratio between the service economy GDP and agriculture sector is 1 to 9.6. If we move this along the present circle, it will become 1.1 to 70. have we looked at from a farming sector standpoint? Do we have a different grammar for this change?
So you want me to answer? Okay. Actually, a very short answer. Have we looked? Actually, we are celebrating the life of somebody who's spent his whole life looking at that and trying to reorient it. In fact, and the last part from the 90s, trying to redress the imbalances that had developed against agriculture after the 90s. The decline in agricultural research. India, when in 1991, when India embarked on this on liberalization, almost the leading plant scientists in every CGIAR institution came from the Indian system. Up till 1980, we had the greatest national agricultural research system outside the advanced capitalist countries, including China. China leapfrogged ahead after 1980. Probably in 1991, these agricultural scientists in the CGIAR institutions were all not only from the Indian system, but somehow in their career linked to Dr. Swaminathan's mentorship. But what has happened since then? The failure to develop independent research in our research system, the failure to invest in agriculture, the failure to modernize, and where agriculture has gone ahead, it has gone ahead in the interest of it has been led by the rich. Every single election in our country is controlled by a small group of people who have not, in the rural areas, who have not taken agriculture ahead. So, to do what you asked, to do what you say has to be done is something that I certainly agree with you on. But to do that is a political struggle. Yeah, it's a political struggle. No. Look at after biotechnology and the public in the public sphere, agricultural biotechnology in the public sphere in India. Look at the progress we made in the 60s and 70s in modern technology, and look at how we completely missed the next transformation of our agriculture, like China did after 1980, but particularly after 2005. So that's a larger question of political policy in India.
Are there any factors which can be located or derived from your analysis that would help explain why the issues that agitated the Punjab farmers, Punjab plus Western UP, Haryana, I don't know, the exact spread of that movement, why it did not have the same resonance elsewhere in even agriculturally advanced states like Tamil Nadu or Andhra Pradesh and so on? Why? What is it? Why was it so segmented?
Very important question.
Restricted.
Very, very important question. One thing is the threat to the mandis, the threat to the kind of the agricultural marketing system. The idea that the markets would be controlled by agricultural markets, the mandis to which farmers sell their grain, would come under the control of large corporations. This was, and in states where, like Western UP, Haryana and Punjab, where the marketing of grains is very important, particularly because they're non-rice growing states. You have to sell your rice. It's completely a commercial crop. So the perceived threat to market, to farmers, the big farmers' control of the means of marketing was, I believe, a very important factor there. The general idea that the corporations would take over many of the institutions that were controlled by
But we say farmer, but we know which section of the farmers control it in North India. This did not exist in Tamil Nadu in the same way. It did not exist in Tamil Nadu.
Thank you.
And it didn't exist also in states. It didn't exist also in states like West Bengal or somewhere where you see, one thing is, there's another, my colleague Ramkumar has been, my colleague Ramkumar has written on this. At least 12, I think he mentioned about 12 states have already passed the marketing laws against which protest took place, you see. But even there, private interests have not really moved in any big way to take over the markets, because the capital is just not coming in there. So it's in areas where the big mandis exist, and farmers of those localities were really worried about a big capitalist takeover of these, that I think it is more there than elsewhere. It's also in Tamil Nadu, it's happening only in sugarcane, which is not a major crop in Tamil Nadu.
Sir, from your inspiring lecture, I understood that the share of wage labor has increased across the country. And what is the impact of this? Do you think the cropping pattern will change from the annual crops to perennial crops, or mechanization will increase?
Yeah, see, mechanization is the sort of impetus for the increase in the labor force. What will happen to cropping? One thing is, one of my colleagues, somebody who is a great advisor for us in the foundation, is B.V. Ragavalu, has pointed out to me that we must now study clusters of high technology, non-agricultural crops to see what different things are happening there, what's happening. So that's another set of questions there. And there is overall, particularly in food grain, there is a decline in labor absorption, in the demand for labor in agriculture, and that's particularly one of the major factors in that is mechanization and also the introduction of herbicides. So that's what I say. What is going to happen? How is cropping pattern going to change? How is cropping pattern changing? Is a very important question. Of course, the great threat that neoliberal economic policy poses is the threat of declining areas under food grain production. That is what has been resisted. Dr. Swaminathan is very clear on this. That his Jawaharlal Nehru lecture, where he said that food sovereignty is the foundation for national sovereignty, and at that point he said that it is essential for a country like India, and you know that Bhavani is here too. You know that the Farmers Commission proposed that the C2 plus 50 formula, that you take the costs, including the costs of management, add 50% to that, and you should cover those costs when you set a minimum price. But Ram, I didn't take that up. MSP is also a very important factor in this. MSP was also a very important factor. But so you should, yeah. So the C2 plus 50. So that's why he was very. There was the need to diversify crop production, the need for modern crops, for nutritionally diversifying. But that solid base of grain production was something that he wanted to firewall with the C2 plus 50 formula. That was the foundation for national sovereignty. That is the foundation for food sovereignty and national sovereignty, and that was something that he was unwilling to compromise on. I say all this. I say all this because I agree with him. I don't have to say I agree with that. what forms will new cropping patterns take, and new types of how do you diversify incomes by diversifying crops, is something which I'd like to study more, and it's a more open question. Thank you.
I think we can have a separate seminar going back and forth on the many questions that you have raised. So I hope your colleagues at FAS will organize one, or we'll do one here. So just two questions, partly related. The first one is about, say, economies of scale. To what extent does the current pattern of a huge amount of fragmented, very tiny to small land holdings, but nevertheless contributing such an enormous part of production, surprisingly large amount. What does that imply for economies of scale? And you would recall some of our Chinese colleagues also were concerned about this, about after their own opening up, liberalization in agriculture. That's number one. The second and a related question is, on the left at least, and this is a slogan which began with the left but permeated all the political formations of independent India to some degree. Whether they implemented it or not is a different question, but they had always to pay attention to it.
Too hot to get to it.
Yeah, so the slogan of breaking the land monopoly. So, and we, some of us saw it as, of course, as a social and political necessity. We also saw it, I think, at least several of us, that it is, even though it appears to be fragmenting land holding in the first instance, that this is the route to consolidating a greater increase in productivity and ultimately realizing economies of scale as well in technological growth in agriculture. So what comes of where is this slogan now of breaking up the land monopoly? And just one footnote is that you mentioned this point that MS has made about food sovereignty as the basis of national sovereignty. He's still being heard in China because the latest last week they announced how by 2035 being food sovereign remains the goal of China's agriculture.
Whereas when we went in 2006, they were saying that they may not be able to meet 100%. Thank you for these. On the economies of scale, it's still. Firstly, let me just say I did not talk about landlords and big capitalist farmers. That was not part of the. That is not my subject for economy. It's absolutely the crisis of small production is the crisis of economies of scale, or the crisis of, and we have actually FAS has a book on this. What do we have? Is it here? The what ails the small farmer? What is the exact title? How do small farmers fare? Says one of the editors of that book. And Ramkumar's book is there also on agricultural deprivation. The main, aspect, or the main sort of underlying factor, causal factor in this is problems of economies of scale. You cannot reap economies of scale on such tiny plots of land, and you cannot do it. You cannot do it when two things further inhibit this. One is that in almost all of India, the class structures are such that the rural poor cannot set up organizations for farming together that somewhat compensate for the diseconomies of scale imposed by ownership. You can transcend that. You could try to transcend that by different forms of cooperative or collective or group farming. these institutions, I mean, and such institutions are, of course, inhibited by the kinds of socio-economic formations we have in different parts of India. In Kerala now we are trying, the government is trying to set up, joint cultivation groups through Kudumbashri, etc. But that kind of arrangement is simply not available in areas where the social oppression goes hand in hand with class oppression. Breaking the land monopoly is a very important question. See, what forms does it take? Let's get one thing clear. When we talk about breaking the land monopoly, we're talking about breaking the land monopoly in very new circumstances. If you take the left writings of the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, the idea among scholars also was that title to land is the basis of agrarian power. The basis of economic power in rural India is the title to land. Now that has changed. That's it's enormous. The technological change and the so-called Green Revolution has made an enormous difference there. And yet we know that unless that not only is title to land, not only has that changed, very often, and this we are finding in our data, among the rural rich, the percentage, even in UP where there's a big increase in sugarcane income in that particular village, the enormous increase in the chunk of income that's earned through real estate, hotels, and so on, modern non-agricultural means. So that also puts a different light on the question of breaking the land monopoly. Breaking the land monopoly, and yet, if you do not somehow eliminate the power of that class in the countryside, I don't think that you're going to have any change, you're going to have any significant change in poverty, in what I said, the condition, in poverty, in access to education, in access to health, in access to food, knowledge, access to scientific thinking. This will not change unless that power is broken. I refer you repeatedly to the village in Samastipur where we studied, where actually a line is drawn on the ground, and the big owner can say that on that side of the line it's one wage, on this side of the line it's another wage. So that kind of backwardness, coexisting with, he also corners all the government schemes and so on, but that with a kind of moderate. So it's very difficult now. Given also that wage earners are not dependent in the old way. See, just as the landlord is not dependent in the old way on the wage work, on the rural workforce, so also the rural worker is not dependent in the old way on the landlord to pay him wage. You can leave. You can leave the village. You can, and the landlord can wait out a large wage strike. One thing, but we have not had for some years a movement of a whole village to take over all the land of the rural rich. We've not had it for some decades now. And yet, even when there's a small movement to seize house site land, the repercussions and the counter attack by the state can be ferocious. I point out the case of Andhra about a decade ago, where there were deaths. But actually, you were only seizing the land you were sort of seizing the land that you already occupied, but demanding ownership. So it's really very difficult. Now, I think these are very complex, which brings me to my point that I think one thing that we have to do is that think nationally, and these are huge. There are huge movements going on nationally, but also identify how we can, how we can break through by studying the local, by identifying issues that will bring relief to the working people in the countryside, and bring people together for social change is something now we must also work at from below upwards. This is Brinda.
There's somebody online.
Anybody online?
Yeah, there's one person online. Can you please identify yourself? You are unmuted. You may ask the question. Yeah.
Yeah, I am V Raman.
Hello, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much for your enlightening presentation. It was very comprehensive. I really enjoyed it. I think my clarification is something on the point that you mentioned about this reverse tenancy, and you also did mention that Dalits, lease in lands. So, do you think that this is a process that could be legitimized by legalizing it? That's one part of the question. The second part of the same question is that, do you think that this wouldn't contradict the Marxist popular ideology on land reforms?
You have to say that. Why would it do that? I'm not sure. What are you saying? That I don't fully understand. This, can you?
No, I'm seeking your views on that. I mean, and it's in Kerala it is so clear, and in other states also it's almost clear that there is an increase in tendency for reverse tenancy. So what I'm asking is that in what way that we could legitimize it?
I think
can we legitimize it by legalizing it? And if so, does it contradict the Marxist understanding of land reforms or Marxist?
I think I think the Kerala context is slightly different. General rule of thumb: Kerala's problems are different, but for anything to do with India, social sciences of India, but no. See, in the rest of India, Ravi Raman, I don't think that I am not in any way. If I've given the impression that I'm wrong, but I shouldn't have done so. But I'm not in any way moving away from the demand that tenancies be controlled, be fair, and finally that the land go to the tiller. So I mean that's not. I'm not loosening my. I do not hold to that demand any the less now or in my point of view. So I guess that's my reply. Kerala's issue about legitimizing reverse tenancy, well, that's a different issue. That's a very, as you know, a very complex issue that we have to solve in Kerala itself.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks. Brinda.
Thank you, Ram. It was a very useful summary that I got. Particularly, I wasn't aware about the GVA part that you said. But I'm a little curious to know why you didn't touch anything about minimum wage and its compliance, enforcement.
No, I said that.
Touch minimum wage laws. Because there's such a huge
wage
sector.
yeah, that's true. That's true.
It was huge wage sector, and you need to take a look at it.
Yeah.
And also in the context of going forward with a living wage, because we thought agriculture is probably not able to show so much of compliance of minimum wage, though we are seeing that little more in other sectors, particularly in states like Tamil Nadu.
You said it.
And is because they don't have enough surplus or productivity or so to be able to do that. So then therefore going forward,
I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. But carry on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying.
That's what a rich farmer would say. I don't say that. Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so that's and therefore going forward with a living wage kind of argument, would it really ever have any impact on the wages of the rural casual workers. And the second thing is related to the women's increase in employment that has largely happened through unpaid work, right? Unpaid family labor in the recent PLFS rounds, particularly post-COVID. So that is also another segment that probably needs to be, particularly with the feminization part that you talked about, and they're not going to be under any form of, support, but they are very much a large part of the labor force.
Yeah. Two things. One is, I agree on this question of compliance with the formation of minimum wage, compliance with the rural minimum wage. These are extremely important questions for any agrarian movement. I did want to say that the actual wages, which I mentioned, are so low that you'd have even 600 days would barely get you to the poverty line. And your last point was on. That's actually that's the interesting question. That what are the socio-economic characteristics? What are the occupational patterns? What is the remuneration or earnings of this huge new section that is joining the rural labor force according to the source of data that I cited? That's a very important question. That's open. It's a question that we've been working on it. We have a book on that. But this is really, as I said, it should form an important part of our analysis and understanding in future. Is that we do have actually written about when you do a survey, for instance, or you study a household. You have to study the female labor force in that household separately, and don't apply common criteria. You have to look at very specific features of how female labor is deployed in that household. So don't let the household as a unit of investigation get in the way of your understanding the female labor force, as it has in the past for many years. But I'm going to stop there. I broadly agree. But and the second is that is what we have to study right now. I don't know whether. By the way, I don't know. By the way, if you say that mainly all unpaid, I don't know. We have to find that. You have to figure it out. We have to figure it out. Yeah.
So there's a last question.
So I was just wondering, you started by saying that there is an increase in the men and women workforce in agriculture. Is it in Kerala's perspective that you said, or it is all over India?
No, today I haven't spoken about Kerala.
Okay.
Much
so
to my
I am coming to that point.
Relief,
2 years before, we were in Karnal in Haryana. So there was a farmers meeting going on, and it was coming out from all this farming community, both men and women, that the younger generation are not that much interested.
Absolutely.
So now this is a very, very important point, that if our Indian agriculture contributes to a lot of GDP for our nation, how do we engage and make this workforce in next 10 years or 20 years, that from where we came from famine to surplus, are we going back to the backward, or how do we go ahead? How do you actually make them interested, to keep interest, and what the government should do?
Unless you have modern forms of farming to which you can attract young, educated people, agriculture is doomed. In the long run, that was very much what MSS used to say also. By the way, you should see some of these things, how they work out. When our surveys of 2006 in UP against the surveys of 2023, one big change was school enrollment. Of course, there are problems of completion and quality, etc. But school enrollment was increased hugely. Interviewing a class 8 pass at that time, they were not able to. The quality of that education was so poor that at that point they were not able to read the agricultural pamphlets they were not able to comprehend fully the agricultural pamphlets that were being circulated. So it's this huge task of quality school education, of higher education, of bringing people to evoking an interest in scientific rational thinking and in how to bring new technology to the village. These are huge. This is a huge task, and this is something which is not being paid attention to. When you have institutes of higher, when you have the heads of institutes of higher learning exhorting people to drink urine, this is not the kind of scientific temper that you need to transform India, to transform the youth of India towards an agricultural revolution.
So I think there are no more questions. So thank you very much, Professor Ramachandran, for enlightening us on how the rural community and the rural agricultural community is going up and how women in agriculture are becoming more increasingly important. So thank you very much, everybody online as well as the participants here. So this comes to close with this, the fourth lecture in the series.
May I also thank all those online who are there. Thank you. Thank you all. It's good to see many of you. Thank you, all old friends. Thank you.
So thank you very much, everybody, for participating.